This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras here with my co-host James Mayevsky. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas.
It is 3:12 a.m. in New York City. The reason for that is that James is in Venice right now, hanging out with Willem Dafoe. So, how's that going? How's that going,
It's
James?
going well. Yeah, I mean, so I'm here attending the Venice Biennale, the theater festival that happens each year, along with the Biennale. And yes, Willem Dafoe is the new artistic director of the theater branch of the Biennale. And he's curated a very interesting lineup of productions that is very proximate to my interests in the theater. So it was a good opportunity to come and see a lot of work in a very sort of condensed space of time. This is part of the challenge with theater is, it's not so easy always to see the work that you would like to see because it's happening somewhere else across the world. So we've got, Italian companies represented here. There's a company from Norway that I'm very interested in that's here. There's a lot of talks being given by directors alongside the presentation of work. And so, it might sound nice, and it has been nice, but it's been very busy. It's essentially been like a research expedition. And then of course, too, it's been nice to be able to keep up with work while I'm here. We just finished at the time of this recording, we just finished our spring campaign. So thank you very much to any of our listeners who may have donated to that or prayed for us. It was a great success. And then also to watch this film and continue thinking about it while I've been here. I'm glad.
Yeah, so we're discussing I Confess by Alfred Hitchcock, a film that's been on our docket for a while, and it's timely in a way because of this Washington state law forcing priests to break the seal of confession in certain instances, which it is timely. It's not the reason we decided to discuss the film now. Really, it's because it happened to be playing in a theater in New York for a day while we were both here. And so we went and saw it the first time, there in the theater, and have watched it a second time each on our own since then. But came out in 1953, stars Montgomery Clift as Father Michael Logan, a young priest in Quebec City. And the basic concept is he is put under suspicion of murder. And the bind he's in is in order to free himself from suspicion, he would have to break the seal of confession. That's the basic concept. The film also stars Carl Malden as the inspector who's investigating the case. Carl Malden played the priest On the Waterfront. And Anne Baxter as the priest's ex-girlfriend from before he was a priest, who's part of the reason accidentally why he is suspected of this crime. And Anne Baxter we saw in All About Eve when we discussed that, right? She was Eve. So and we may, if we ever discuss the Ten Commandments, which I watched for the first time recently, she plays Moses' girlfriend in the Ten Commandments. Also a very similar style of performance as in this and the other movie, honestly, except she's wearing like a wig and stuff. But so this movie is based on a 1902 French play called Our Two Consciences. This movie was not a hit. People didn't really get it. They didn't think it was Hitchcock's best work. I think they were kind of like not understanding the motivations of this priest character, for instance, which is interesting because we saw a similar thing with the movie Calvary and with the movie Silence. In both cases, as I remember it, critics were saying, I don't really quite understand what's going on. Why are these characters? What's motivating these characters? I think actually, no, maybe it wasn't Silence, but it was A Hidden Life. I think it was all of those actually.
Right.
Got at least from some critics that reaction. Now, I don't think this is Hitchcock's best film by any means on an artistic level, but this is the one that's of greatest specific interest to Catholics, and it's well known by a lot of Catholics.
Yeah, yeah, I'd describe it as a minor Hitchcock, but it's no less enjoyable for that. So this is the first time we're talking about Hitchcock, and probably not the last. He's certainly a filmmaker that would warrant us covering, more than one of his
Of
films.
course, yeah.
But I think that there are some things about Hitchcock that stand out here, and the first thing that I personally associate with Hitchcock is just frankly a good time. Hitchcock, he's like got like the feel of the people or something. Like he just it's not that he's a popular or maybe he is.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I think he
don't
thought
know.
of himself as an entertainer and somebody. He always talked
Right.
about playing the audience like an organ and
Yes.
stuff like that. So
Yes. So a Hitchcock film to me is a lot of fun. Especially the thrillers, and that's where that's maybe one of the first areas where I would say that this film is a little bit of a departure from what you might expect, because I don't know that I would so much describe this as a thriller. It
mhm.
has some thrilling elements to it, and some of the intrigue. It begins with a murder, right? But what's interesting about the film is that, like from the beginning, we know who committed the murder. There's no question about that.
Right.
So even though this is
Begins with a murder
continuing,
and a confession. Yeah.
right, exactly. The murder, immediately flees the scene and goes straight to the church where we meet Father Logan, and he asks Father Logan to hear his confession. So that's the beginning. And you know, a similar beginning to Calvary when we covered that. That also sort of
Mm,
similarly begins with a
yes.
confession. But even there, you don't know the identity of the person who's confessing.
Right.
Um, you know, so here it's interesting because I think it would be a mistake to classify this as like a mystery or something. There is tension from the question of like, well, is Father Logan going to, you know, break the seal of confession? Is he going to stay true to his responsibilities here? But the intrigue is not around the circumstances of the murder so much. It
Hmm.
really is just about it's a character study essentially about this figure, this priest.
Right. 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 Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting that people mention sometimes Hitchcock being a Catholic director, and it's true he was Catholic. I don't think he was a practicing Catholic all of his life, but there is an interesting article decades ago in the Wall Street Journal by a Jesuit who gave the account of having been called to Hitchcock's house towards the end of his life to hear his confession and to celebrate mass for him at his house on multiple occasions, and described him actually shedding tears after receiving communion on one
Uh,
occasion.
uh,
So it seems like he may have died a good Catholic death. I from the several Hitchcock films I've seen, I wouldn't describe him as a filmmaker with a particularly Catholic sensibility. I mean, I guess people say there's a lot of guilt in his movies, and like there's like the stereotype of like Catholic guilt. There's a lot of like neurosis in his movies.
mm,
But I don't think I really don't believe that his films manifest like a Catholic worldview generally. Um,
yeah.
but he is someone who went to a convent school as a kid, a Jesuit secondary school. His wife converted to Catholicism to marry him. His daughter was raised Catholic, and so he understands the basics of Catholicism, and they're all on display in this film, which is also set in. The setting is interesting because it's set in a. It's not an American priest in Protestant America. It's a priest in Quebec City, this highly Catholic culture in the 1950s. Now it's like the most anti-Catholic place in Canada, apparently, precisely because it was so clerical dominated before that, as has happened in a number of Catholic countries in Europe. Um, but at this is a place where and it's certainly before any kind of like sex abuse scandals in the clergy or anything like that. So it is kind of like treated as absurd, by one of or maybe it's the attorney, the crowned attorney or something. He says like, "Do you really believe? Isn't it absurd to think a priest could have done this?" And all of that. Likewise, part of the tension in the film is not just about him being convicted of murder, but the reason that he's under suspicion in the first place is that he was trying to do this favor for his former girlfriend who was being blackmailed about a situation that they had been in together, a potentially compromising situation, before he was ever a priest. So he's trying to protect her and her relationship with her husband, and she's trying to protect him from being convicted. And so she reveals this information that, neither of them would have preferred to speak about. And that plays into, the motives that the people prosecuting assigned to him, in his anger at this blackmailer of his, his former lover. And so that also plays into the question of the stakes not just being his conviction, but the damage to his reputation in the trial itself. And again, that the fact that the reason that the stakes are so high there is, again, it's a society where priests are respected and that something is expected of them. And so the level of resentment and contempt that may be turned on them if they turn out to be a scoundrel might be much higher than if a priest were to break his vows today, which might be, winked at or looked at even with approval by society.
Yeah. I think that you mentioned, that this film is made before any of the sex abuse scandals, and of course that was something that I thought about at the time of viewing this for the first time. But since then, I've really come to think that this film is ahead of its time in a lot of respects. So, for our listeners who haven't seen this film, maybe listening to Thomas describe the plot, maybe it sounds kind of convoluted or contrived in the way that like some mystery plots are, where it's like, it's almost like you could see the writer like working backwards, from the solution that he needs to get to, and how is he going to kind of weave these things together. There's a satisfaction in that, but it can also seem a little ad hoc. And I think that if you evaluate this film strictly on its plot, that it can come off as a little thin, a little superficial maybe. But especially on my second viewing, I think that what makes this film interesting is not so much the sort of like the bare structure of the plot and the particulars of, who's covering for who and why, but again, like I said, is really, I think, the main focus of the film, which is the character study of this priest. And I think that it's ultimately a parable about scandal and the scandalousness of the institutional priesthood. So that includes, the scandal of like when a priest does something bad. But I'm thinking about scandal more broadly. My understanding, I think, is, the root of that word refers specifically to stumbling block. And I think that this institutional priesthood is a stumbling block, just sort of its own, without the priest having done anything. And that you see that kind of on display here from the very beginning. So, for example, this murderer comes to the priest and confesses and receives forgiveness, and what happens? Instead of feeling, at peace or having, a clarity of what he needs to do next, or like having his conscience cleared or anything like that, actually, this begins to work on the perpetrator, really to his ultimate destruction. He cannot fathom that this priest won't go to the cops and rat him out. And so you see this character, his name's Keller, Otto Keller. He I just realized that sounds like auto killer. I don't know if that, but
Interesting.
Otto Keller. He really kind of begins to unravel, and it's all a projection of his own uh, guilt, his own duplicity onto
Mhm.
this priest, you know,
Right.
and um, and there's this great line that has. He has a lot of great lines, but at the very beginning, in one of his first interactions with the priest, after the confession, he asks him, "Are you human?" You know, like almost as if to say, like, "Can you understand like why I can't turn myself in?"
Hmm.
He says something like, "You're so good. It's easy for you to be good." Um, and of course, we see throughout the film that it's not so easy, right?
Hmm.
So I think that that's a framing device. I think that that's like a hermeneutic that Hitchcock wants us to carry through in looking at the ways that people respond to Father Logan, really by either projecting their own sort of guilt or shame or anxieties onto him, or by sort of like refusing to like recognize his humanity by kind of seeing him as a a almost like inhuman type of perfect being or something, incapable of murder, or you know uh incapable of keeping his mouth shut, you know, uh it's some of these thoughts I haven't fully developed yet, but when we watched it the first time, I really had this sense that, okay, you know what, this is actually a very interesting film. It's not, again, like the most perfect uh, film. It's perhaps not one of Hitchcock's best, but I do think that one of the things that Hitchcock accomplishes here is a pretty sophisticated study of the humanity, the humanity of the priesthood, and of the scandal that that represents.
Yeah.
And we see that in different way, reflected in different ways in different characters, but
Yeah.
also reflected in the society. So that's where I think it's very significant that it's set in Montreal, where it's
Quebec
this
City.
Catholic, or yeah, right, Quebec City, this Catholic culture. And so there is
The
a
inspector himself, was an altar boy for or maybe a choir boy, I think, I forget, for the other priest that's at the same parish
right,
with Father Logan.
right. But I think that in time you see actually the same kind of dynamic that's happening inside of Keller. You see it actually en masse in the mob, in the people. Once information comes out and Father Logan is put on trial, you see this kind of projection of everybody's kind of um, like resentment onto Father Logan. And so he really becomes a scapegoat. He really becomes a type of Christ, taking on the sins of everyone else because they cannot believe that he's not guilty of what he's being accused of, whether that's the murder or the the like affair essentially with a married woman. Um, we, the audience, know that he's not guilty of these things, um, but everybody else can't see that, and it's a dynamic that I think Hitchcock is exploring here in how people actually relate to this institutional priesthood,
Yeah.
or it's sort of one facet of that exploration.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I will say that I found the film and its conclusion much more satisfying on my second viewing.
Me
On my
too.
first viewing, um, spoilers, the trial takes up a good chunk of the end of the film, and it just kind of it looks bad, and then suddenly the jury says not guilty, with the reservation that he's been what do they say that
They
what's
they
the
they have him. They place him under grave suspicion.
of the murder or of just like being a bad guy?
I don't. Yeah, I guess just
Anyway,
being a bad guy. Actually,
so
this upsets the inspector, who leans over to the crown prosecutor and he says, "Why couldn't they have just said not guilty? Why did they have to say all the rest of that
right,
stuff?"
because he's not interested in morally judging him. He's interested in solving the case. The
Exactly.
inspector is kind of
Yeah.
this clear-sighted individual in that sense.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So that even
So
sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say that, as long as we're uh, bracketing this with spoilers, anybody who doesn't want to know the end of the film can stop listening at this point, I suppose. Um, but even after Keller has sort of outed himself as the killer, the inspector is very insistent that he wants him alive. Don't shoot him. I want to talk to him. And you can interpret that as, one, his like kind of dogged insistence on solving this murder. He needs to hear it from him himself.
Hmm.
But I actually think that it's motivated by a desire to clear Father Logan's name. With that verdict, we put him under grave suspicion, but we don't think it's been proven, and so we say not guilty. And his sort of displeasure at what has essentially become a character assassination, it would almost have, we have Keller say later that it almost would have been better had he just been found guilty, and I think that that's probably true. Um, I think that one of the reasons why in the sort of final moments of the film the inspector is so insistent on not killing Keller and on getting a confession from him is because he feels this need similarly to clear Logan's name, Father Logan's name.
Yeah, well, going back to, I mean, maybe one of my favorite scenes in the film is the first time that Father Logan is questioned by the inspector, and it's just a very entertaining scene. Carl Malden is really great in it, and you can see him. He's asking, he's being the sort of clever, sort of wry detective, and he's asking Father Logan these questions, and Father Logan just won't answer any of his questions because he doesn't want to and they're not even seal of confession questions. They're just like, I want to protect this woman and her reputation and private matters of counsel and stuff like that. And you can see the inspector getting more and more frustrated, but not just and more suspicious, but it's almost like he doesn't want to be suspicious. He says, "I'm deeply sorry," I think, when he ushers him out of the room. And the reason is that, it's not that he wants to be suspicious. He's forced he's being forced to be suspicious by his refusal to answer these questions. And so he never really wants to see, he's dogged when other characters want to put blinders on, say it couldn't have possibly be the priest. He's dogged and he's the one who's on his case. But it's always from the inspector being faithful to his vocation, you know?
And it's a great performance. He does a really great job with this character. And I think seeing his interactions with different characters throughout is one of the pleasures of the film. But
can I go back to what I was trying to say about the? Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was trying to say about the trial on first viewing. I felt that it was, this is too easy. They're just making him not guilty, but it's going to be a damage to his reputation. And I felt like, for me, it was like, I felt like, this would be more powerful if he actually was convicted. There would be more sacrificial, and then because that sort of the trial wasn't actually as dramatic as I expected it to be. Sometimes things play based on your expectations, your reactions to a film,
Sure.
And so then the sort of chase scene at the end where basically, again, spoilers, Keller's wife finally breaks because she can't stand to see the priest suffer, and she runs to say it was my husband who killed him, and then the husband shoots her, and then he goes off on the run, and then we have a classic Hitchcock set piece in a famous landmark, namely this famous, I forget the name of the hotel, but it's like the most recognizable building in Quebec. So I thought, well, then now they're tagging this action sequence on to kind of add some drama at the end of this film. I didn't feel that way at all at the end of my second viewing, because the sense of people truly not understanding the priest, I was much more aware of that. People not understanding him and his vocation. And so It's extremely satisfying when at the end you see all of the people around him finally realize, because Keller says, "You heard my confession." Everybody finally realizes it. It's like it had never even occurred to them that the seal of concussion would be even a factor in this case, and why this priest has
Yeah.
been so uncooperative in giving information. And so that's very powerful. And one of the things you see is this woman who's still been in love with him this entire time, finally like accepting, oh, this is like, she sees, it's like proof that this is his vocation. Like this, she
Yeah.
sees how heroic he's being in his vocation. She always has thought he is a good man, and heroically caring about her well-being and all of that, but to see him like sort of as a priest, pure and simple in that moment.
Right.
And she leaves before the scene even ends, because she's like, I'm satisfied, basically.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so you've brought up a couple other examples of this stumbling block, sort of scandalous nature of the priesthood, that are shown from different angles. So first, in the case of the prosecutor, his stumbling block is that he cannot fathom why this priest would not share certain information except to hide guilt. So this is the only sort of rubric for the inspector to consider the priest's actions. So this, whereas Keller can't fathom this priest actually being faithful to the seal of confession and not going to the authorities, the inspector can't fathom why he would hold on to this information. Now, in the case of the Anne Baxter character, she has an interesting perspective on him, because she actually is kind of alone in knowing his humanity. She knew him intimately before he was a priest. In fact, before we get this long flashback of their romance, and their time together, she's in the interrogation room, answering questions from the inspector, and the first thing she asks him is, "Are you a human, Inspector?" She asks this as like an appeal to his humanity before she tells him what it's like being young and having a first love. And so we get a repetition of this question from the beginning: Are you human? And now we see the priest's humanity. The first time I watched this film, I thought this flashback sequence was maybe a little overwrought, maybe a little long. But the second time I didn't feel that way, because now we're really being shown Father Logan in a completely different aspect, without his collar, behaving in ways that we would not sort of like bat an eyelash at for any other leading man in any other film. But because this is the priest that we've known for the first, 2/3 of this film or whatever, everything, strikes us differently. And so for her, the scandal is that he wouldn't still love her, right? She is still persuaded somewhere deep down. In fact, we have her say as much when they meet together on a ferry to discuss, this case. She tells him that he still loves her, and it isn't until the end, like you said, Thomas, where something is reconciled for her, where she recognizes, actually, yeah. I mean, what does he tell her on the ferry? He says, "I chose this. I believe in what I am." And he says this as like a protestation at her disbelief, She can't believe that he would not love her. And perhaps he does, still love her somewhere. We see, again, how things aren't so easy for him. It's that there is a real suffering and a sacrifice entailed with all of this. And nowhere is this clearer, I think, than in a sequence that we get. I can't remember if maybe it's right before the trial, but he's walking the streets of Quebec City in his cassock, and he's just kind of like, it's almost like this agony in the garden sequence where he's at the night before, so to speak. He's about to be put on trial, and it's going to be the decisive moment of his passion, really. And he's conflicted, and you really see cinematically represented in this montage his loneliness, not the least which because he's dressed so differently from everyone around him, but he actually, walks up to a storefront where he sees a mannequin dressed in a suit, and you see, represented visually this possibility that really is closed off to him. Um, and in fact, actually, one of the shots is of him walking in the distance, while in the foreground is a shot of our Lord carrying his cross. It's a statue. So I think that this is a very intentional move by Hitchcock.
Right.
Um,
Right. And the
but
walk concludes with him going back to his church and sort of looking at the sanctuary, the altar, presumably the tabernacle, and then the next
yes,
thing you know,
yeah,
he's turning himself in.
yes. So I kind of lost where I was going with this, but that we see represented frequently, even if not spelled out for us explicitly, that this man is human, that he's virtuous, he's doing his best, but it's not without a cost,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
and so even if he doesn't love um uh uh oh, I can't remember the character's name, but this ex-girlfriend, even if he's not in love with her in that sense, he does a far better job of loving her ultimately than does Keller. Right? Keller is the other person with a romantic relationship represented. He's married, and he even says that the motive for his murder was to get money. I mean, he didn't intend to kill the guy. He was going to just rob him. But
Right.
he needed money because it pained him to see his wife have to work.
Right.
But ultimately, this drives him to what? To killing his wife. He
Right.
shoots her down when she's about to spill the beans.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that something that Hitchcock does is almost frame Keller as a kind of uh, foil or antithesis, um, to Father Logan. My reason for thinking this is this final shot, this final set piece, where he flees into the hotel, and where is the place of his last stand? It's up on a stage. It's
Yeah.
a strange place to
Yeah.
like stage this final confrontation, but to me, it's a visual rhyme. I think with the first time that we're introduced to Father Logan. Um, we first see him looking out the window of the rectory as he sees Keller absconding into the church late at night.
Right.
But then the next shot is him, emerging up on stage, essentially from the sanctuary,
Right.
coming
Yeah.
down and meeting him in the pews. And so I see here a kind of secular sanctuary, that he runs off to
Mm-hmm.
up on the stage,
Right.
and a kind of inversion of
Sure. Yeah.
the so while Father Logan has to carry the sins of not just all these people that he's close to, but really the whole world. Everybody whose confession he hears. I mean, this is a burden for all priests. This man Keller, he can't even handle his own sin, let alone the sins of others.
Mm.
And rather than protect others, he kills them. And so there is, this very interesting dichotomy,
Yeah.
present right at the end. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that this film is so ahead of its time, because I think even if it's in an imperfect way, Hitchcock is exploring this theme that probably a lot of people would have been very resistant to exploring. Um, the sinfulness or potential sinfulness of a priest, or the innocence of a priest in the face of grave suspicion, right? And this
Right.
is something that we are now very familiar with too, right? So
Yeah.
without downplaying the horrific nature of all of the abuse scandals, it's also true that there have been a lot of innocent priests accused, and that for them this is a real white martyrdom,
Right.
and perhaps it would have been easier for them to have just been you know executed
Yeah.
summarily, you
Yeah.
know. But we get
Right.
this line from Otto Keller at the end where he says it would be better if you were as guilty as I am, and then you mustn't suffer so much.
Hmm.
Ah, you know. But like this is the scandal of the priesthood, and then ultimately, really, of Jesus, of the incarnation. You know. So
Right.
I think it's a fascinating film. I think that on a first watch, it's easy to kind of, uh, sort of take it on face value and be like, oh yeah, that was fun, but there's not much to it. But I think that actually, it stands up to repeat viewings, and there's a lot to think about the various different ways that people are responding to this priest.
So, yeah, I wonder if I'm trying to think what is it that makes it less perfect than some other Hitchcock films. I think maybe it just isn't as dramatic. In some ways, it's somewhat lacking in dramatic juice at certain points. That's how it feels to me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it would be. The trial is not that dramatic, for instance.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah,
this is a
I
problem
think
with
that.
this is a problem with trial scenes. Sometimes there are a lot of films that involve a trial get bogged down in a long trial scene in the last third of the movie. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to
Well,
put what do you think would make it less of less of a successful Hitchcock film in certain ways.
for me, I think it does boil down to the plot being a little uh, clunky. So I,
Right.
I think that, you know, uh, in the best Hitchcock films, you get an incisive character study, with a lot of psychological realism and depth, linked up with a really compelling narrative and plot structure that keeps you on the edge of your seat from the beginning to the end. And here that's not so much the case. And I think that, you know if the plot is a little clunky, um, uh, or perhaps not as like seamlessly integrated, um, so too the character study is also not as fully developed. I think it's there for people who want to sort of scratch the surface and go into it, but like I said, on my first viewing, it didn't really hit me. It wasn't immediately
Right.
apparent.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, I think that this has all the hallmarks of a Hitchcock film, um, and I still definitely recommend it, especially to
Yes.
Catholic audiences,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
It
but
doesn't always have that level of tension throughout.
yeah,
Um.
yeah.
Yeah.
But one thing
Um.
that I think that you can also appreciate about this film, from a Catholic perspective, is the relative, fidelity. This priest is faithfully reproduced. Like Hitchcock doesn't take any pot shots. It would have been very easy for another filmmaker to cheapen this representation.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot of temptation to like juice things up, gin them up in a lot of ways, or just to misunderstand the priesthood, or what
Mhm.
might be motivating a priest. But I think that, in this depiction of the priesthood, of the sort of interior sufferings of the priest, the uh, kind of loneliness or the isolation of the priest. Loneliness might be the wrong word. I think more the set apartness of the priest, because we get actually a Father Logan shoots this down, at the end. Again, Keller sort of accusing him says, "Then I am as
You're.
alone as you are," when he
Yeah.
finds out that
Yeah.
he's killed his wife. And the priest, without missing a beat, says, "I'm not alone." And
Right.
you get a sense that this is not just uh, about like the people that he's with, because in fact, for
Right.
most of this film, the people he's been with have misunderstood him. But
Right.
it's a
Right. Right.
spiritual
Right.
reality.
Yeah.
But oh, I forget where I was going with this. Oh yeah, just that Hitchcock understands this set apartness, and
Yeah.
uh, and is able to kind of get inside of the person of this priest, and what he has to go through. So I think that this is very rewarding for
Yeah.
Catholic viewers, who
There,
maybe are used to seeing priests not depicted so well.
there's a famous interview between Hitchcock and the French director Francois Truffaut, which was, became a book. And at one point during this, they're discussing I Confess, and Hitchcock said to him, "We Catholics know," him and Truffaut, "we Catholics know that a priest cannot disclose the secret of the confessional, but the Protestants, the atheists, and the agnostics all say ridiculous. No man would stay silent and sacrifice his life for such a thing." So
Yeah.
he's bringing a Catholic understanding to it. Now it's interesting, in the original play and the original screenplay based on the play, the priest and the woman had an illegitimate baby before he became a priest.
Yeah.
Because there's the sort of thing where they had to spend a night together in a gazebo because they were caught in a storm. And in the film, it's played like he denies, anything untoward happened, and people suspect him, of course. But I kind of believe him, in the film.
Yeah.
So in the play, I wonder how that functioned, why they would have included that element. But
Yeah.
the other thing was that the priest is executed at the end of the play and the original screenplay, and both of those elements were removed because Warner Brothers feared, that it would be controversial.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and this is actually, I think, one way in which the film suffers, I think, because a lot of the dramatic oomph of the film hinges on the scandalousness of what's being hidden, right?
right,
And what's being hidden in this film is just something that might look bad. Oh, we got
right,
caught in a storm. We had to go take shelter in a gazebo. Nothing
right.
happened, but it looked bad. And so
Mm-hmm.
someone saw us, and now we're trying to keep that from being okay. I can understand how even just causing scandal like that would be bad enough, but it lacks some of the real, like serious
Well, he is
danger that,
basically
say,
perfect,
right, right.
Yeah,
So I think that it struck me, especially on the second viewing, that like, okay, this must have been something that was changed. Like he probably did have a compromising situation, and essentially like a lapse with this woman. Now again, this is before he was a priest, so that's mitigating, but it was still when he was, intending to become one, and so that probably, if that came out, it would have been perhaps disqualifying for his being accepted into the priesthood. But also, it was after she had been married. Now, she hid it from him. He didn't know, at least in the film, that she was married. But
right.
this is a big deal, you know.
Yeah.
So this is adultery, you know. So
Yeah.
even though it's not adultery in the film, I think that we as the viewers have to really understand it as adultery for the film to work. So
Hmm.
I think that it's totally a legitimate read, except that we get protestations from Father Logan to the effect that that nothing happened between them.
Right. And
So
we're given no reason not to believe him, just as a
right.
character.
We don't
Yeah.
want to think that he's lying,
Yeah.
But I think that really, like, in terms of the narrative, like, for this to really work, something really bad had to have happened in that gazebo, and it's more compelling, if it had been that.
Yeah. That's interesting, and I think also I believe before I saw the film for the first time, I had unfortunately read that in the original play, the priest is executed at the end, and I think that, in retrospect, that probably contributed to my feelings at the ending of the first film, my first viewing of the film, being kind of like, well, this is a little bit too low stakes.
Mm,
But again, on the second viewing, I was much more attuned to that question of other people understanding his vocation as a priest, and so I don't know if that even had a place in the play in the same way as it did in the film, because they had to come up with some other kind of dramatic, ending. Yeah, I'm sure it had some kind of place, but I don't know if he had been executed, how they would have all sort of found out.
I think I could totally see the film ending on this sort of downbeat of just his execution, and everybody moves on. But we, as the audience, have seen, we
Right.
understand. But I think that it's interesting, the title "I Confess." Um, you know, it's a snappy title,
Yeah.
but we get more than one confession here, right? We get the
Yeah.
confession at the beginning from the murderer. We get a confession later from uh, the ex girlfriend of what happened all those years ago. But then we also get a kind of confession from the priest. And it's a confession not in the sense of a confession of guilt, but it's a confession of faith, This moment in the trial where he's very directly asked a question, pertaining to the murder, we get this great shot of him in profile with a crucifix hanging on the wall right next to him as he says, "I can't say."
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is not the first
Which
time
is
we've
his
heard him
mental
say those.
reservation. Yeah.
Yes, it's not the first time we've heard him say those words, but it's a kind of a confession by omission, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
That
He
it's this
literally
confession
can't
of
say,
faith.
but it's passing as just the expression "I can't say," meaning I don't know.
Right,
But he
right.
literally can't say.
Yeah, but it's to his credit that he doesn't even resort to that. He doesn't even spell it out. Like, listen, I heard somebody's confession and now I can't say it, because even that would be breaking the seal. So he's
Yeah.
perfectly
Right.
circumspect in his responses. Um, but we see where it's coming from. It's not coming from a superhuman, perfect saint. It's coming from someone who's being faithful to his promises, um, despite the suffering that it will cause him.
Yeah, there's a lot of nice little touches to nice Hitchcock touches in the film. I mean, some cool shots. The steeple shots montage, the shot where the wife is sort of trying to get a read on the priest to see if he's gonna like break, and she's like walking. She's serving them at the table, and she keeps like walking back and forth behind his head and sort of looking at the back of the back of his head. There's like a
Yeah,
POV
well,
shot of the back of his
it's
head from
awesome
her
because it's like
perspective.
everybody knows this experience where you're trying to like get a read on someone, and so you're just trying to make eye contact with them to like check in with them, like see what's
Yeah.
going on, and she just can't see his eyes.
Right.
So it's
Right.
this awesome, like, because he's not playing into it. She's
Yeah.
freaking out, but he's not. Yeah.
There's also a couple of like enigmatic little touches that I'm not sure what the significance of, like the other priest in the rectory who has a bicycle that he keeps in the hall and it keeps like falling over. Like you almost expect that to like play into some investigation somehow, but it never
Yeah.
really does. But it's just this kind of
Yeah.
eccentric little touch.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I picked up on is like when you I don't know if it's when you first, it might be when you first see the crown prosecutor. He's like doing this trick where you balance a penny in between two forks like over a glass. Like I googled it, and it's some like lame like trick. I don't know if it's magic trick or
A parlor
even,
trick.
yeah, like not
Yeah.
even a magic trick. It's like a parlor trick. Yeah. So yeah, he's doing that. You see him doing that. I think it's maybe when he's first introduced, and then the second time you see him, he's at a party and he's like leaning back and balancing a glass on his forehead.
Yeah. And it's
So
another parlor trick. They're literally in a parlor entertaining
yeah,
guests and everybody's
yeah.
laughing.
Yeah, and so I didn't think about like how that applies to his character until now, but there is the scene where he's this pretty sympathetic character. I mean, he's kind of goofy, but like during the investigation, he's the one who's kind of like pulling the brakes on it and like doubting how this priest could be guilty. When he gets in the courtroom, he's this like totally like exploitative like
Yeah.
performer, and he's like putting motivations in the priest's mouth and kind of asking these incredibly leading questions, and it's like this real performance. And then afterwards, the inspector says something like, I don't know, are you satisfied with all this? And he says like, do you think I enjoy it, or something like that? It's like, I don't know, it seemed like you did enjoy it. So I guess those are maybe like part of his personality as like a performer or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
But
It's
they are
interesting.
actually these like really cheap, like lame little parlor tricks that he's doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I think that's about it. But yeah, it's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it already. And you know, another arrow in our quiver of like priest movies that we've discussed on this.
Yeah.
Now, this may be like the least conflicted, you know, priest character, least complex priest character that we've discussed so far, actually.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I think he's a good example of how we don't need um, our characters to have moral failings for them to be interesting or to be, you
mhm.
know, uh, for there to be dramatic tension. And so, uh, you know, I think that uh, yeah, he might not have the same kind of conflicts that we see in some of the other priests in films that we've covered, but that there's no less depth there, I think, in terms of like what's being explored in the priest's psyche. So I think it's cool to add this into the roster, you know, of cool priest flicks. And it's also cool to see the overlap that emerges, you know, among these films.
So what priest
There's
films
def-
have we discussed? Calvary, Leon Morin, uh,
on the waterfront.
on the waterfront. Yeah, which
Yeah,
is not
there
really,
might
the
be.
priest isn't really a main character in that, but um,
He's a pretty
yeah,
main character.
I guess so.
And
Um,
there's probably one or two others.
anyway, my point is eventually, well, we haven't done Diary of a Country Priest yet, but Nazarene.
Yeah,
But eventually we're gonna work our way back to
Monsieur
Bing
Vincent.
Crosby at some point. Oh yeah, Monsieur Vincent. Yeah, yeah. But eventually we're gonna have to make our way back to Bing Crosby. You know, we're getting more mainstream as we go on. We just did I Confess, and so we're gonna eventually get to the Bing Crosby, Going My Way, Bells of St. Mary's, which I've never seen. But I imagine that those will not be quite as edgy as, you know, any of the other ones that we've discussed so far. But we'll see.
Who knows?
I mean, how edgy can a guy named Bing, you know, really be?
Well, you know
Uh,
what we could do is we could do a sort of like compilation episode where we talk about all these different priests in Hollywood lore, and compare and
I
contrast.
honestly, that's not a bad idea. At some
Yeah.
point, yeah, once we get enough of them under our belts. Okay, well, that was fun, and everybody, thanks again for anybody who donated to our campaign. Thank you again very much. And thanks for listening, everybody. And we will see you next time. Thanks, James.
Yep. Bye.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.